And we're back, and today we're going to meet the Red Hand, the evil Soviet super scientist organization.
And
And to talk about that, after this cutscene, we'll talk about Lysenko.
This is not the future my family once saw for me. The great various doctors. I used to think my sister was the unlucky child, but it would be me. It became known my father collaborated with the Soviets, even after the occupation. He abandoned us rather than face his shame. If we spoke of him, we expected spit in our face. I studied in disgrace and could find no work in the cities, so I came to the villages. Because the people care more about what I do for them than my name. And I search for my father's work. The work of the Red Hand. You could not fairly call what I found in their underground laboratories medicine or science. This is where the trail took me. To the observatory that sits over the village. In that abandoned place, I found documents, recordings, catalog after catalog of crimes against life itself. And a sealed door. I began stacking the stuff in piles for bedtime reading. Then the vampires came and I had to run. My father would never speak to us of his work, but everything he left unsaid, he also left to fester in me. I inherited my father's sins.
That line reminds me.
When I opened those doors to the past, I also opened up a path to redemption. For the name Varias. And for me.
That reminds me of a documentary I saw where they talked to descendants of top Nazis. And it was actually a very moving documentary because a lot of them were like, I had myself sterilized. Which is just a weird thing to think about. But we're going to talk about Soviet science and Lysenko. Lysenko was a charlatan who convinced Stalin that genetics work differently than it really does.
sort of. Okay. Let's go back to talk. So, this is in the 20s and 30s, and this is right when the study of genetics as we know it is starting to take, they didn't isolate DNA until 20 years after all of this boiled over. So, this was all, people were still, at this point, evolution was scientifically accepted, but how it worked was not. And there were all kinds of theories still being pinned down and worked out. And the one that won out, the one that had the strongest basis, was hereditary evolution by use of genetics, which at the time nobody was entirely sure how it worked, though people had a reasonably good idea of what that meant for a thing. But that's another story. But there were a bunch of other competing theories, the most famous of which was Lamarckianism. After a guy, Lamarck, who came up with it, basically says that as animals or plants use traits repeatedly, their descendants inherit those traits are naturally grown. With the example being trees gradually grow up higher to escape giraffes, and giraffes grow longer necks to eat trees and eat tree leaves. And so they both get taller over time, and that's why giraffes have long necks. Turns out that's bullshit. They didn't know, but as of the 20s, they kind of knew that, but it was still something that you could at least sort of reasonably argue. And then the Soviet Union came up, presenting itself as like this. Having, after overthrowing one of the most conservative regimes in Europe, they tried to sell themselves as most advanced and scientific and progressive organization in the world. And they started making decisions based on the idea that they really knew what they were doing, which they did not. And it backfired. and in many cases it deliberately backfired. And you got shit like the Holodomor in Ukraine, where enormous amounts of people died, as basically it's effectively a form of genocide. But that's a discussion that's probably best served for something else. So shit was wild, and shit was very centralized, and shit was very ideologically based. So then come
it was very much how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but for communism.
yeah, and there was a lot of work being done in all kinds of different scientific areas based on trying to apply Marxist theories of class and societal development to nature. They're selling it to the state ideology. They're shaping it to their state ideology to get government funding. The Soviet economy was. We really don't have a modern analog for the Soviet economy anymore. It had money. Didn't have really private industry, but had people doing things. But it was run in bureaus in a way that no modern state really even tries. Like even countries like Cuba and China don't. China at this point is just is an authoritarian dictatorship with its with what's called state capitalism. Basically, capitalism with the state participating.
It's basically just authoritarianism with a coat of red paint.
Yeah, and Cuba. I think Cuba runs something vaguely similar, but mostly it's just, it's a smaller dictatorship. It didn't have the scale and concentration that Soviet bureaucracy did. But yeah, so all this shit's going down, and you have all kinds of weird shit and you have all kinds of people did a lot with this in anthropology and trying to talk about. If you've ever heard people talk about how there's a term called primitive communism, the idea that all societies before they became settled and started developing class stratifications were perfectly egalitarian paradises. That it has parallels elsewhere. That was developed here, and that was developed in that period and spread out of the Soviet Union. So there's all of this shit going down, all of this stuff being thought of, but it's not being kept to the soft sciences or the humanities. It starts leading into the hard sciences. So there comes a man named Lysenko. And Lysenko had an actual scientific background. He was up until he was a part of the Soviet scientific infrastructure, which, for all of its faults, which were many, was an actual scientific infrastructure. And it actually that doesn't mean anything, but it actually had they actually trained scientists worth the name. But he had this bright idea of championing this kind of class-based Lamarckian evolution thing that I honestly don't fully understand. And it's it was really, really heavily based on. Okay, so I mentioned how the Holodomor and Soviet, the Soviet way the Soviet economy worked. They basically tried to standardize agriculture and revolutionize it, and failed, and caused massive famines. And this happened a lot with communist governments in the 20th century, but they were really bad in the late 20s and early 30s. And he came up with this great idea he sold the idea that you could sort of graft different kinds of plants onto each other and just use that to increase crop yields. And he wrapped it in all of this sort of plants working together.
Rhetoric.
Yeah. What?
He wrapped it in political rhetoric.
Yeah, exactly. I've never heard it pronounced rhetoric. So I'm just it took me a minute to catch that. It's rhetoric.
Whatever.
Yeah, whatever.
I pronounce things weird.
Yeah, whatever. We learn words on the internet these days. Who knows? But what was it? he basically came up with this wonderful vision of class-based biology and started shielding it hard. And Stalin who had just come to power and really sealed the deal at this point. He was a huge fan. He loved the idea. And Lysenko looked at the people around him and went, "You know what? Fuck you people," and started hissing directly up to Stalin, denouncing everyone in his way. And it took off. Became a part of Soviet life, basically the baseline of Soviet science. It didn't work. Also, it was a crackpot theory based on putting politics over science, and it works about as well as any of those crackpot theories that put politics over science do. But it took years for anyone to be able to push that through the Soviet bureaucracy's head, and he risked death by telling Stalin he was wrong. So there were a lot of crop failures and a lot of just more misery that didn't have to happen that did happen because of this thing. It was a real awful fantasy.
But now we can talk about all the cool things Soviet science did, like the Russian sleep experiment. No, I'm just kidding.
No, that's... I mean, like, if you get... That's a famous creepypasta. There's a reason that people put it in Russia instead of some other country. Because that combination of, like, disdain for human life, because you got that a lot in the Russian space program, which had a lot of disdain for human life. And life in general. Like, you know, people will talk about Laika as the first dog in space, but she was never meant to come back down alive. And they just skimped out on security. Not security, on safety measures there. It just got people killed. But, it was such a mess. It worked, sort of, and they got stuff up a lot easier than Americans did, because they were willing to cut the margins a lot closer. And because they were willing to, like, take even bigger risks on an enterprise that was insanely risky in the first place.
And they did that on a lesser... Well, a lot of the reason they could make those corner cuts is they were working with a lot less resources than the U.S. space program.
That too.
Like, the Politburo never really supported space the way the U.S. supported space.
Even then, the U.S. supported space in a very specific era. In the moment that, like, basically Nixon came into office, went, "This is really expensive," and looked at the space shuttle as something that was cheaper than a conventional rocket. And just sort of, that's where that funneling happened.
Well, there's also the fact that the Soviet economy was inherently smaller than the American one.
Yeah.
So you're getting a smaller piece of a smaller pie. So what they managed to do with it is still really impressive.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that the Soviet Union was never able to really cover, because the thing about the U.S. is that we just had more more varied natural resources than Russia did. Russia has lots of natural resources, but it doesn't have warm regions like the U.S. does. It doesn't have, it has big flat plains, but it doesn't have the kind of, like, the Midwest.
Big flat plains. It doesn't have a Midwest. That's basically just Ukraine.
When I say that, I mean, what I'm trying to get at is that there's a huge chunk of the central part of the country.
Okay, I want to interrupt. This is a puzzle. You have to activate 3 things in a room with cameras in the correct order, and it's full of turrets, and it's a bunch of goddamn bullshit. Especially because there's an achievement for this area for not being seen. So you have to perfectly do this area, and you can only do a mission once every 8 hours.
Yeah.
There's an 8-hour cooldown on missions. So again, this should have been a single-player game.
Yeah, Secret World failed. Fell flat once again. Which is Fiesta. And it sucks, but we've already talked a lot about it. It sucks. But I do appreciate to put hoods on the giant mechanical monstrosity. It's very easy.
Well, that's a vampire. All of these are vampiric super soldiers.
Yeah. So, like, the Soviet super soldier thing, that's that's something that is actually probably worth talking about because it's vaguely related. Because like Soviet culture as it developed was extremely communal well, for obvious reasons. That's what communism was all about. But like it put
But
very little.
wasn't there very much an emphasis on building the new Soviet man?
Yeah, there basically there was a lot of, since there was less emphasis on individual choice and development, there was a stronger emphasis on someone like, I mean, there were, even in the U.S. there was the American dream, and there were concepts around what the ideal American homemaker or whatever would be, but that wasn't a thing in the Soviet Union. You didn't have any real you had some appreciation for individualism, but it was discouraged by like state order, sort of. Not formally, but like the whole idea was this is a communal society. You are reaching exaltation through the work of the people around you. So they put a lot of effort into developing this like concept of the true ideal person. They like the ideal Soviet man. And it didn't really go anywhere because the Soviet Union had issues with keeping its population under control from day one. Because the thing about
not to mention the issue with racism.
Yeah, and sexism.
Yep.
The Soviet Union, America is really bad at this, but every government is bad at this. Like any ideological government, as a rule, is blind to its own faults when their ideology backfires, or the inability of the ruling group to get how they aren't meeting their own ideology. Like, in a lesser way, you can see this right now in a weird way with how every few years a really powerful American politician will walk into a grocery store and start excitedly talking to reporters about those like grocery store laser scanners. Because these people are rich. They've grown up in rich people. They've never had to go to a grocery store themselves. And if you've never been to a grocery store, seeing something that shoots a laser at something else and is kind of cool. It looks fun. And they have no idea that that's just so boring and ordinary. The idea that it wouldn't be, in fact. America has this like idea of a sort of cult of egalitarianism where everyone is supposed to be able to work their way up from the bottom to the top. Where no matter who you are, where you start, ultimately you can be able to climb to the top. But the people at the top that's never really been true, and in recent years, it's gotten
increasingly less true. We're gonna meet the vampire hunter now. The vampire hunter's kind of cool. We meet him. He has 2 missions, and then there's a cutscene where he shows up later. But he looks like he's been burnt. He also sounds really familiar. I don't know why.
All vampires have the same weakness. That makes them vulnerable. They might live forever, but without blood, they're harmless. Every day they need to drink. And once they've run through the wild game, they need to rely on field rations, so to speak.
I know what you mean. This guy sounds like somebody out of
Most of them are mongrels, lowest to the low. Willing converts to undeath.
Did you ever see that movie Van Helsing?
They've been recruited from the ranks of criminals
no.
and misfits, promised eternal
that
life
is...
and glory.
I enjoyed it. It's like a B movie with like
Some are older, stronger.
Guy who played Boromir.
Clever too, and they're real tough to
But
put down.
it's really weird. It gets really weird.
Pure
But I enjoyed it. It's kind of a
Been around
steampunky
since
sort
the
of
dawn
vampire
days,
hunter movie.
since
I
the
remember
night
hearing
moved
that was
fast.
very much a
Not
modern B
past
movie.
5 seconds in that fight.
Oh, it very much is.
So
If you
I have to
enjoy
be
B movies,
smarter
you would
than
love
them.
that. Especially if you like
More
vampires or
resourceful.
steampunk. There's a Gatling crossbow.
It's taken me a while to find the right mix. but I think I got it now.
I mean, just
I
the
haven't
fact
been
there's a
able
Gatling
to
crossbow
get close
automatically
enough
makes
to
it a
give
good
it the
movie.
proper test run.
If you're in the
Tell you
proper
what,
headspace for that sort of
seeing
movie.
as you're pretty much immortal your own self.
Then again, I'm the same guy who liked
Be honest.
Waterworld, so...
I mean, like, there's definitely room. I mean, I've seen people who talk about, what was it? I think it was the Tomb Raider movie as being an underappreciated, like, not
Quick
good
access
classic,
inventory
but
updated.
more fun than people gave it credit for. And we've talked about the Star
I've
Wars
never-
prequels.
Well, the prequels still get defenders.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I think people appreciate the prequels now in the wake of Obi-Wan because they appreciate that Hayden Christensen is actually a good actor. He was just directed horribly.
Yeah, like, the Star Wars prequels had they been any other, had they not had the branding on them, they would have been pretty good. That would have been trilogy. They would have pulled in enough money on their own to support a trilogy. It could have been their own franchise that stood separately from Star Wars. But they had the Star Wars branding, and they were not the original trilogy. They had better.
I think part of the problem is he's just not as good a director as he thinks he is.
He's one of those guys. The thing about Lucas is that Lucas is actually a brilliant businessman, but he's the kind of guy who's never actually had an original thought in his life, but he's very creative with what he has, so he can steal ideas from a billion different sources and recombine them in ways that no one ever seen before. So that it doesn't really matter that it doesn't matter that, Star Wars is hero's journey with a sort of pop Buddhism slapped on top of a revenge story.
I can't remember who it was, but I learned recently that a major Japanese actor from like the Seven Samurai was offered the job as Obi-Wan.
That would have been interesting, but I'm not surprised.
I mean, can you imagine a more samurai-influenced rather than the wandering sage Western style?
I mean, like, Lucas talks a lot about Akira Kurosawa. That's what the lightsaber duels were based on. Like, especially...
Well, as we see them in the original trilogy, the lightsaber duels are very much Western.
I mean, the lightsaber
they're based on the Western medieval styles, aren't they?
Not, I wouldn't say so. I mean, like, we don't get a proper saber duel until like episode 6 of that trilogy. You have Obi-Wan and Vader hitting each other's swords for a bit, and then you have Vader clowning on Luke for a while until as he tries to turn into the Force. Like, those are not. They're both good fights. They're very entertaining to watch, but they're not.
But they're not the choreographed fights you see in the prequels or the later stuff, where they have actual sword fighters go in and say, okay, you do this, this, and this, and that makes it look showy but not dumb.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the sword fights in the prequels, I love those fights. They're wonderful to watch. They're very stupid. And, like, there really is a point in episode 3 where Obi-Wan and Anakin just start waving the swords back and forth before hitting, not doing anything, just showing off.
But you have to understand, they're using different Jedi they're using different lightsaber forms. Obi-Wan is focused on a defensive form, while Hayden Christensen is the attacking form. They're both equally magic because they're brothers. I know of this for some goddamn reason.
Don't get me started on Form 4 and 5. I know those. I know which numbers those forms are. Though I have to admit I am biased because my parents got me into Star Wars very young, younger than they probably should have. Because I mean, I had to see the Wendigo. Luke cut open a Tauntaun, and then the Wampa. What was it called?
Whatever.
The Wampa come and eat the dead animal. And I think it was like 5, and I think that was not something I should have seen at that age. But like, I got into the.
You had to see the ultimate. You had to see Star Wars at 5 so you could understand that light will always defeat dark.
I mean, that's like, there's definitely I don't think it hurt me much in the long run, but like, for what also, it doesn't hurt that Star Wars came out, but I think they showed me the original trilogy specifically because the episode 1 had just been announced and they wanted me to know what was coming before I went in. So
yeah, like if I could see a timeline where Lucas just gives, well, not gives, but like is incapacitated and has someone else use his script notes, and we get a decent sort of weird action political thriller about the fall of the Republic, that would be much better.
Yeah, like he was not, he did, like I said, Lucas has never actually had a critical thought in his life. What he is good at is combining things that he takes from elsewhere and doing them in ways that are not immediately apparent. And he's good at doing that really, really well. But when he tries to do stuff on his own, when he tries to just come up with his own shit, it's cheesy. It's very clearly designed to sell shit to kids. And that's
Jar Jar.
Yeah, I mean, Star Wars. When I say Star Wars from day one was about selling shit to kids, like top and bottom before episode 4 was toy sales, and like that's how he built LucasArts and it currently exists off the back of selling toys for episode 4.
Have you been watching Andor? Because I hear it's good.
I've heard Andor's really, really good. It's one of those things.
I've heard it's essentially just 1940s Polish resistance in space.
Yeah,
it's literally just an anti-Nazi resistance in space.
Yeah, I've heard good things both about the quality of the show, about like, you know how I was reading about Terry Pratchett. How Pratchett's really fun to read. The wordplay, the characters are always really fun. There's also always something deeper going on that really adds a deeper resonance to all of the messing around. I hear that.
Yeah, it's like Hogfather, like that great speech Death gives at the end about the meaning of, what would happen if I didn't save the Hogfather? The sun would not rise in the sky. You mean the world would end? No, a mere ball of flaming gas would illuminate the world. He goes on about how humans need imagination to be human.
Yeah, and I mean, I love Monstrous Regiment. That's my favorite book of his, and that's one of the darkest books he ever wrote. Have you read it?
That's the one. I have not read Pratchett still. It's on my list.
Oh,
I still haven't read Pratchett.
God damn.
But I've heard that Monstrous Regiment is the one about the country that's been at war so long that all the men are dead, so the women disguise themselves as men to fight because only men can fight.
Pretty much, but it is. I mean, and for context, and this is only very minor spoilers. This is the kind of book where one of the characters has flashed sideways to Vietnam, and they just all of a sudden he's talking about Charlie and trying to make coffee out of grounds out of bark, because that's what they did. But even then, there's a lot of stuff. It's about the nature. There's shit in there about the nature of oppression and of how people co-opt parts of minority groups to maintain control over the rest, that you would not expect to see from something that's billed as a dark comedy. And it's it's a devastating book, but it's a brilliant one.
I do like, at one point I view one of those end logs in here. I think it's this mission, and it says, the dragon would do it, the Illuminati would do it, we are 97% not culpable. Or something to that effect, like, we're 97% not culpable. And that's just so totally Templar.
Yeah. They're the good guys. They're closest thing the setting has the good guys. But
they are the Tau, essentially.
Cool
kinda. I mean, but depending on what you think about Tau concentration
camps.
The thing that's mentioned as a one-off and a third-party spin-off.
I mean, and they're it really depends. I mean, I've seen.
I mean,
more
I'm
about
I'm just yanking your chain. Like, I get that they're not a democracy or any sort of communist ideal. They're very much a caste society in the Hindu model.
Just happen to ride the
Yeah,
same
they're
boat across
they're
these
kind of
stormy
fucked,
seas.
but they're less fucked.
And they're still the least fucked up thing in that universe. This guy really fucking hates the secret world, by the way.
In the secret world, aren't you? Oblivious to the ripples you make by throwing rocks from the top deck. Ripples that end up killing innocents. There's a nest of vamps, and I don't know
I mean,
what up on
he's
that
right,
farm.
but as far as the other point goes, there aren't a lot of the kind of rocks they throw have to be thrown, or there won't be a lot of innocents left for them to crush. Like, there's a.
I mean, I wish my character could just say, like, you can kill me now, like, I come back. If you want to put a bolt in my head, that's cool, dude.
Yeah, if you want to take out your anger, it's like that makes sense. Won't hold it against you. Maybe it'll make you feel better. It's a relatively minor inconvenience to me, but you still get to kill me.
Or so help me God. When this is all over, I will hunt you down.
That's not much of a. I bet this would. You just look at this guy and go, I bet that sounds like a tough boss fight that'll take a few rounds. Like, it's...
Dude, I killed Loki, okay? Like, you're not...
At this point, you have, at an absolute minimum, defeated the Norse trickster god and an ancient undead pharaoh corrupted by forces from outside of reality. A vampire hunter is not that big a threat.
I mean, I wouldn't put it past him to be just really annoying if I did kill him, like showing up to kill me at random times, like in Yakuza.
Yeah, I've heard of most of the Goro everywhere model.
Yeah, Kojima, whatever his name is, everywhere. He like Majima. A bunch of random Majima everywhere. Bunch of random encounters where he pops out of like a. Turns out oh no, that's not a real cop. That's Majima.
That is a really funny way to have that character jump in and be chaotic.
Gyu-chan!
It's like with Mr. X in Resident Evil 2. Where he's just around, stomping around, and sometimes you have to run away. And then somebody... I do love the videos where they change the music whenever he shows up to X gonna give it to you, or give me $20.
Oh yeah, that's good.
And it just, like... It's very fitting. Oh god, have you seen the real-time fandom on Resident Evil 2?
No, I saw the most famous one where they do both Sonic Adventure. I think they did Sonic Adventure 2. They did the Light and Dark campaigns, and it has Eggman giving his big announcement. I remember that one.
Yeah, Eggman's announcement's famous. But they did one for the Resident Evil 2 game, and it has to be seen to be believed. It's amazing what they did, but also, like, the person who hosted, the person who voices Sonic, also did the recording, and she does a lot of really, really funny shit just with how she filmed it. Like, just there's one corpse that she just stops in front of and stares at for 20 minutes solid. Like, there's two campaigns there. They go through the same area, and she just has them stare at each other for 20 minutes. But she managed to figure out a glitch in Mr. X's AI, where she would just go in and out of a door frame, and he'd start stomping down towards her, and then turn around and walk back up the stairs over and over. And watching them improv their way through this and gradually lose their shit as it keeps going on and on it's a thing of beauty. It's a thing to behold.
Descended very far from talking about Soviet science, but it doesn't really matter.
I mean,
because we talked about the main topic, which was Lysenko.
Yeah, like who's grading us? Like
I am grading us in my head.
You can judge me all you want. I don't
know. Only God can judge you, okay?
He'll just look at the list of 360 fucking mitzvot. Go. Yeah, well, you didn't. You haven't sacrificed enough sheep to the temple, so you're going into oblivion. There we go. I wish I liked revenants in this game more. They're
they usually show up only for boss fights, but I like the lore behind them in that they're literally manifestations of suffering.
Yeah, and they are
which of course makes you think, what does the Secret World version? Which of course makes me think of what we talked about many times before, that Geist book, and what in the Secret World those areas must look like.
For me, I just like that. I've talked about this before. I got into the Secret World for being announced the first couple trailers. I remember the Templar trailer. It had the Templar character face off against a Revenant with a shotgun, and that was a great cinematic. That was beautiful. Do you remember seeing those when you were first airing them?
I think I've seen them once or twice, but by the time I got into this, it was long after launch.
Yeah, like
all the expansions had come out, everything was done.
Yeah, like the buzz was. They really did a very good job with, okay, I remember paying attention to the Fallout 4 launch campaign, pre-launch campaign, the ads, and they did this really effective thing where they would wait 4 months between announcements, and every time had an announcement, it would be an absolute bombshell, something that the gaming media would froth over, and then they would retreat into isolation. And then out of nowhere...
I remember the reveal of the settlement building, and everyone's like, "Oh, that's so cool!" And then it's not really integrated into the gameplay at all. It's just like a cool thing you can do.
Yep.
That really doesn't serve a purpose unless you install a bunch of mods.
Honestly, I really like the settlement building, but that's a reason that it's a gameplay goal as gameplay itself. It's kind of a weird way to phrase the structure.
I foresee it being much more integrated into Starfield. That was very much a proof of concept thing in Fallout 4.
And the frustrating thing is, the concept has already been proven. Those mods have been around since, I think the first, Bethesda settlement mods were in Oblivion or something. At least since Fallout 3, and definitely in New Vegas. That shit had been there for at least half a decade by the time Fallout 4 started, really getting into development.
Well, Bethesda games.
They're Bethesda games. This is the kind of game where 5 years later, the developers will discover that walking through a treasure because they didn't design pathfinding quite the way they thought they did. Bethesda games are so weird. It's what makes them wonderful. But
I am very much looking forward to Starfield. I very much hope that with the Microsoft money they have now, they can do some decent QA.
Yeah,
that is why I think it got pushed back. Is Microsoft took one look at the finished product and been like, you're gonna do QA on this.
Yeah.
They go to the head of Microsoft and they say, okay, we're ready to launch. Well, what's the game look like? Oh, it looks like this. Are you fucking serious?
No. Bethesda QA is making sure that...
We bought you. You don't do that anymore, Bethesda. Here's some money. Do some QA. Jesus.
Bethesda QA makes sure you don't crash the desktop on clicking the first menu button when you boot the game. It does not cover
anything else.
Yeah. Which I do honestly, and this is kind of a weird thing to say, but I hope it's janky, because a Bethesda game isn't a Bethesda game without the stupid jankiness and glitches. It's just not as fun. Because you don't get, get these stories out of it. You get putting barrels over people's heads and stealing, robbing them blind. You can't see.
Oh, I expect stuff like that. I just expect a lot less explosive crash to desktop and corrupted saves.
I mean, yeah. I wasn't playing Skyrim on launch. I was. Maybe I'm just lucky in this specific area, but I very rarely experience crashes when I play. I don't like. I bought what was it, Scarlet, the day after it came out. I had a moment of slowdown when I hit the biggest city, and I'm watching people walk like 3 frame a second GIFs. It's very amusing, but that's the worst that game gave me. There were a lot of had a lot of weird placement in fights where I'd start a fight and I would be in the middle. My character would just be standing between Pokemon as they glass and waiting for each other. But I think that's just it was just that. That was the only series of glitches that never went away. For me, it was a relatively stable experience.
The thing for me was I bought Fallout 3 on launch. And let me tell you, Fallout 3 was buggy. And for a long time, getting that to work on any system was a mess of workarounds and EXE patches.
Yeah.
Especially because it had games for Windows Live, which didn't exist after a certain point, so you had to spoof it. And only recently, now that they've been bought by Microsoft, did they go back and patch it, which means every mod for that decade-old game has to be remade. Long after most of those mod makers have moved on.
That's a tragedy. And I mean, you have a few still, people are still modding Morrowind, so you've got a few still piddling around doing whatever, but that's just well, though, to be fair, for a game that old, you can just roll back the patch, because there's not going to be, the last patch before that would have been 3 years, and that's a very generous estimate. So there's plenty of, you're not going to cripple your computer if you decide not to update it, or try to force it to a previous patch. But that's all technical shit that you shouldn't have to do.
So this mission we have here is to build one of the evil scarecrows and then bring it to a set piece, which is a giant windmill that has some missions associated with it that I'll do next video. And I should warn you, after I build the scarecrow, my game has this weird graphical glitch that I kind of power through till I get to the windmill and then stop the recording, because I wasn't going to do more recording. Well, I wanted to finish the mission. So I apologize for the graphical glitch you're going to see when I build the scarecrow.
Yeah, it's part of the video game experience.
Oh, Falconeer, I actually looked up the rabbi who founded your movement and found out he was excommunicated in 1999 or something. And it's like...
Reconstructionist?
Yeah, how do you excommunicate a Jew?
There's a board of rabbis, of Orthodox rabbis in Jerusalem that thinks they can do that. And not only do we make fun of them, we bring it up sometimes. That's the sort of thing you share at a more boring kind of party. But yes, I am a heretic. I like it. I think it's cool.
Speaking of heretics, you playing Darktide?
Nope. Yeah, it's action game.
Oh, right, you can't do those. Yeah, this is the weird glitch I got.
Well,
I have no idea what's fucking going on.
If you had to see something in Romania, at least you got to see those iconic mountains.
We will be seeing those. That's the third area of this mission pack. After this, after the farmlands, it's a forest, and after the forest, it's the mountains. and then we're in Tokyo.
Get to the Sylvania part of Transylvania, and then in the trans part of Transylvania. Actually, is not. That was a weirder way to phrase it than I anticipated, but you know.
I mean, the only Sylvania I know is from Warhammer Fantasy, and it's full of vampires and the undead.
Fair. That would be. That's fair. But like, I remember I found a Warhammer mod for Crusader Kings 2. I watched a vampire hunter take over the Empire and conquer Sylvania. That was weird.
There is one thing I want to say. Now, I'll talk about it later. It's a weird hang-up I have with Warhammer Fantasy, because it's a medieval setting, but there aren't any Jews.
Yeah, that's a good point. I can't think of the animal. Well,
there are gypsies, but there aren't Jews. It's weird. But that was the video. Thank you for watching.
See you guys next time.